contest between the capitalist and the wage laborer dates back to the very origin of capital. It raged on throughout the whole manufacturing period. But only since the introduction of machinery has the workman fought against the instrument of labor itself, the material embodiment of capital. He revolts against this particular form of the means of production, as being the material basis of the capitalist mode of production. In the 8th century, nearly all Europe experienced revolts of the workpeople against the ribbon loom, a machine for weaving ribbons and trimmings, called in Germany Bandmuhle, Schnürmuhle, and Muhlenstuhl. These machines were invented in Germany. Abbe Lancelotti, in a work that appeared in Venison, but which was written in, says as follows: in Leyden, this machine was not used till there the riots of the ribbon weavers at length compelled the town council to prohibit it. In Hack Erb, says Boxhorn, referring to the introduction of this machine into Leyden, anti hos viginti surciter annos instrumentum quidem invenerunt textorium, quo solus plus pani et facilius confiscere potret, quan plures equali tempor. In turbi ordi et queruli textorum, tandem usus hugis instrumenti a magistrado prohibitus est. After making various decrees more or less prohibitive against this loom in, and the States General of Holland at length permitted it to be used, under certain conditions, by the decree of the 8th December. It was also prohibited in Cologne at the same time that its introduction into England was causing disturbances among the workpeople. An imperial edict of H. Feb. Its use was forbidden throughout all Germany. In Hamburg, it was burnt in public by order of the Senate. The Emperor Charles VI, on H. Feb., renewed the edict of, and not till was its use openly allowed in the electorate of Saxony. This machine, which shook Europe to its foundations, was in fact the precursor of the mule and the power loom, and of the industrial revolution of the 8th century. It enabled a totally inexperienced boy to set the whole loom with all its shuttles in motion, by simply moving a rod backwards and forwards, and in its improved form produced from two pieces at once. Bout a wind sawmill, erected near London by a Dutchman, succumbed to the excesses of the populace. Even as late as the beginning of the 8th century, sawmills driven by water overcame the opposition of the people, supported as it was by Parliament, only with great difficulty. No sooner had Everett Inn erected the first wool-shearing machine that was driven by water power, than it was set on fire by people who had been thrown out of work. 50,000 workpeople, who had previously lived by carding wool, petitioned Parliament against Arkwright's scribbling mills and carding engines. The enormous destruction of machinery that occurred in the English manufacturing districts during the first years of this century, chiefly caused by the employment of the power loom, and known as the Luddite movement, gave the anti-Jacobin governments of a Sidmouth, a Castlereagh, and the like, a pretext for the most reactionary and forcible measure. It took both time and experience before the workpeople learnt to distinguish between machinery and its employment by capital, and to direct their attacks not against the material instruments of production, but against the mode in which they are used. The contests about wages in manufacture presuppose manufacture, and are in no sense directed against its existence. The opposition against the establishment of new manufactures proceeds from the guilds and privileged towns, not from the workpeople. Hence the writers of the manufacturing period treat the division of labor chiefly as a means of virtually supplying a deficiency of laborers, and not as a means of actually displacing those in work. This distinction is self-evident. If it be said that millions of people would be required in England to spin with the old spinning wheel the cotton that is now spun with mules by people, this does not mean that the mules took the place of those millions who never existed. It means only this, that many millions of workpeople would be required to replace the spinning machinery. If on the other hand we say that in England the power loom threw weavers on the streets, we do not refer to existing machinery that would have to be replaced by a definite number of workpeople, but to a number of weavers in existence who were actually replaced or displaced by the loom. During the manufacturing period, handicraft labor, altered though it was by division of labor, was yet the basis. The demands of the new colonial markets could not be satisfied owing to the relatively small number of town operatives handed down from the Middle Ages, and the manufactures proper opened out new fields of production to the rural population, driven from the land by the dissolution of the feudal system. At that time, therefore, division of labor and cooperation in the workshops were viewed more from the positive aspect, that they made the workpeople more productive. Long before the period of modern industry, cooperation and the concentration of the instruments of labor in the hands of a few gave rise, in numerous countries where these methods were applied in agriculture, to great, sudden and forcible revolutions in the modes of production, and consequentially in the conditions of existence and the means of employment of the rural population. But this contest at first takes place more between the large and the small landed proprietors than between capital and wage labor. On the other hand, when the laborers are displaced by the instruments of labor, by sheep, horses, and in this case force is directly resorted to in the first instance as the prelude to the Industrial Revolution. The laborers are first driven from the land, and then come the sheep. Land grabbing on a great scale, such as was perpetrated in England, is the first step in creating a field for the establishment of agriculture on a great scale. Hence this subversion of agriculture puts on, at first, more the appearance of a political revolution. The instrument of labor, when it takes the form of a machine, immediately becomes a competitor of the workman himself. The self-expansion of capital by means of machinery is thenceforward directly proportional to the number of the workpeople, whose means of livelihood have been destroyed by that machinery. The whole system of capitalist production is based on the fact that the workman sells his labor power as a commodity. Division of labor specializes this labor power by reducing it to skill in handling a particular tool. So soon as the handling of this tool becomes the work of a machine, then, with the use value, the exchange value too, of the workman's labor power vanishes. The workman becomes unsaleable, like paper money thrown out of currency by legal enactment. That portion of the working class, thus by machinery rendered superfluous, no longer immediately necessary for the self-expansion of capital, either goes to the wall in the unequal contest of the old handicrafts and manufactures with machinery, or else floods all the more easily accessible branches of industry, swamps the labor market, and sinks the price of labor power below its value. It is impressed upon the workpeople, as a great consolation first, that their sufferings are only temporary, secondly, that machinery acquires the mastery over the whole of a given field of production, only by degrees, so that the extent and intensity of its destructive effect is diminished. The first consolation neutralizes the second. When machinery seizes on an industry by degrees, it produces chronic misery among the operatives who compete with it. Where the transition is rapid, the effect is acute and felt by great masses. History discloses no tragedy more horrible than the gradual extinction of the English handloom weavers, an extinction that was spread over several decades and finally sealed in. Many of them died of starvation, many with families vegetated for a long time on a half a day. On the other hand, the English cotton machinery produced an acute effect in India. The Governor-General reported, "The misery hardly finds a parallel in the history of commerce. The bones of the cotton weavers are bleaching the plains of India." No doubt, in turning them out of this temporal world, the machinery caused them no more than a temporary inconvenience. For the rest, since machinery is continually seizing upon new fields of production, its temporary effect is really permanent. Hence, the character of independence and estrangement which the capitalist mode of production as a whole gives to the instruments of labor and to the product, as against the workman, is developed by means of machinery into a thorough antagonism. Therefore, it is with the advent of machinery that the workman for the first time brutally revolts against the instruments of labor. The instrument of labor strikes down the laborer. This direct antagonism between the two comes out most strongly whenever newly introduced machinery competes with handicrafts or manufactures handed down from former time. But even in modern industry, the continual improvement of machinery and the development of the automatic system has an analogous effect. The extraordinary power of expansion of the factory system, owing to accumulated practical experience, to the mechanical means at hand, and a constant technical progress, was proved to us by the giant strides of that system under the pressure of a shortened working day. But who, in the zenith year of the English cotton industry, would have dreamt of the galloping improvements in machinery and the corresponding displacement of working people, called into being during the following years, under the stimulus of the American Civil War? A couple of examples from the reports of the inspectors of factories will suffice on this point. A Manchester manufacturer states, "We formerly had carding engines, now we have, doing the same quantity of work, we are doing with fewer hands by, at a saving in wages of £1 a week. Our estimated saving in waste is about % in the quantity of cotton consumed." In another fine spinning mill in Manchester, I was informed that through increased speed and the adoption of some self-acting processes, a reduction had been made in number of a fourth in one department and of above half in another, and that the introduction of the combing machine in place of the second carding had considerably reduced the number of hands formerly employed in the carding room. Another spinning mill is estimated to affect a saving of labor of percent. The Messrs. Gilmer, spinners at Manchester state, in our blowing room department we consider our expense with new machinery is fully one-third less in wages and hands. In the jack frame and drawn frame room, about one-third less in expense, and likewise one-third less in hands. In the spinning room about one-third less in expenses. But this is not all. When our yarn goes to the manufacturers, it is so much better by the application of our new machinery that they will produce a greater quantity of cloth, and cheaper than from the yarn produced by old machinery. Mr. Redgrave further remarks in the same report, the reduction of hands against increased production is, in fact, constantly taking place. In woolen mills the reduction commenced some time since, and is continuing a few days since. The master of a school in the neighborhood of Rochdale said to me that the great falling off in the girls' school is not only caused by the distress, but by the changes of machinery in the woolen mills, in consequence of which a reduction of short-timers had taken place. The following table shows the total result of the mechanical improvements in the English cotton industry due to the American Civil War. Hence, between and cotton factories disappeared. In other words, more productive machinery on a larger scale was concentrated in the hands of a smaller number of capitalists. The number of power looms decreased by, but since their product increased in the same period, an improved loom must have yielded more than an old one. Lastly, the number of spindles increased by, while the number of operatives decreased by. The temporary misery inflicted on the workpeople by the cotton crisis was heightened, and from being temporary made permanent, by the rapid and persistent progress of machinery. But machinery not only acts as a competitor who gets the better of the workman, and is constantly on the point of making him superfluous. It is also a power inimical to him, and as such capital proclaims it from the rooftops and as such makes use of it. It is the most powerful weapon for repressing strikes, those periodical revolts of the working class against the autocracy of capital. According to Gaskell, the steam engine was from the very first an antagonist of human power, an antagonist that enabled the capitalist to tread underfoot the growing claims of the workmen, who threatened the newly born factory system with a crisis. It would be possible to write quite a history of the inventions made since, for the sole purpose of supplying capital with weapons against the revolts of the working class. At the head of these in importance stands the self-acting mule, because it opened up a new epoch in the automatic system. Nasmyth, the inventor of the steam hammer, gives the following evidence before the Trades Union Commission, with regard to the improvements made by him in machinery and introduced in consequence of the widespread and long strikes of the engineers in. The characteristic feature of our modern mechanical improvements is the introduction of self-acting tool machinery. What every mechanical workman has now to do, and what every boy can do, is not to work himself but to superintend the beautiful labor of the machine. A whole class of workmen that depend exclusively on their skill is now done away with. Formerly, I employed 4 boys to every mechanic. Thanks to these new mechanical combinations, I have reduced the number of grown-up men from 2. The result was a considerable increase in my profits. Yours says of a machine used in calico printing, at length capitalists sought deliverance from this intolerable bondage in the resources of science, and were speedily reinstated in their legitimate rule, that of the head over the inferior member. Speaking of an invention for dressing warps, then the combined malcontents, who fancied themselves impregnably entrenched behind the old lines of division of labor, found their flanks turned, and their defenses rendered useless by the new mechanical tactics, and were obliged to surrender at discretion. With regard to the invention of the self-acting mule, he says, a creation destined to restore order among the industrious classes. This invention confirms the great doctrine already propounded, that when capital enlists science into her service, the refractory hand of labor will always be taught docility. Although yours work appeared years ago, at a time when the factory system was comparatively but little developed, it still perfectly expresses the spirit of the factory, not only by its undisguised cynicism, but also by the naivete with which it blurts out the stupid contradictions of the capitalist brain. For instance, after propounding the stated above, that capital, with the aid of science taken into its pay, always reduces the refractory hand of labor to docility, he grows indignant because it has been accused of lending itself to the rich capitalist as an instrument for harassing the poor. After preaching a long sermon to show how advantageous the rapid development of machinery is to the working classes, he warns them that by their obstinacy and their strikes they hasten that development. Violent revulsions of this nature, he says, display short-sighted man in the contemptible character of a self-tormentor. A few pages before he states the contrary. On the other hand, this same dispenser of consolation defends the lowness of the children's wages on the ground that it prevents parents from sending their children at too early an age into the factory. The whole of his book is a vindication of a working day of unrestricted length, that Parliament should forbid children of years to be exhausted by working hours a day, reminds his liberal soul of the darkest days of the Middle Ages. This does not prevent him from calling upon the factory operatives to thank Providence, who, by means of machinery, has given them the leisure to think of their immortal interests. James Mill, McCulloch, Torrens, Sr., John Stuart Mill, and a whole series besides of bourgeois political economists insist that all machinery that displaces workmen simultaneously and necessarily sets free an amount of capital adequate to employ the same identical work. But suppose, besides, that the making of the new machinery affords employment to a greater number of mechanics, can that be called compensation to the carpet makers thrown on the streets? At the best, its construction employs fewer men than its employment displaces. The sum of pound that formerly represented the wages of the discharged carpet makers now represents in the shape of machinery the value of the means of production used in the construction of that machinery, the wages of the mechanics employed in its construction, and the surplus value falling to the share of their master. Further, the machinery need not be renewed till it is worn out. Hence, in order to keep the increased number of mechanics in constant employment, one carpet manufacturer after another must displace workmen by machine. As a matter of fact, the apologists do not mean this sort of setting free. They have in their minds the means of subsistence of the liberated workpeople. It cannot be denied in the above instance that the machinery not only liberates men, thus placing them at others' disposal, but at the same time it withdraws from their consumption and sets free means of subsistence to the value of pound. The simple fact, by no means a new one, that machinery cuts off the workmen from their means of subsistence, is, therefore, in economic parlance tantamount to this, that machinery liberates means of subsistence for the workman, or converts those means into capital for his employment. The mode of expression, you see, is everything. Nominibus malior licet mala. This theory implies that the pound worth of means of subsistence was capital that was being expanded by the labor of the men discharged. That consequently, this capital falls out of employment so soon as they commence their forced holidays, and never rests till it has found a fresh investment, where it can again be productively consumed by these same men. That sooner or later, therefore, the capital and the workmen must come together again, and that then the compensation is complete. That the sufferings of the workmen displaced by machinery are therefore as transient as are the riches of this world. In relation to the discharged workmen, the pound worth of means of subsistence never was capital. What really confronted them as capital was the sum of pound, afterwards laid out in machinery. On looking closer, it will be seen that this sum represented part of the carpets produced in a year by the discharged men, which part they received as wages from their employer in money instead of in kind. With the carpets in the form of money, they bought means of subsistence to the value of pound. These means, therefore, were to them not capital but commodities, and they, as regards these commodities, were not wage laborers but buyers. The circumstance that they were by the machinery, from the means of purchase, changed them from buyers into non-buyers. Hence a lessened demand for those commodities, voila tout. If this diminution be not compensated by an increase from some other quarter, the market price of the commodities falls. If this state of things lasts for some time and extends, there follows a discharge of workmen employed in the production of these commodities. Some of the capital that was previously devoted to production of necessary means of subsistence has to become reproduced in another form. While prices fall and capital is being displaced, the laborers employed in the production of necessary means of subsistence are in their turn from a part of their wages. Instead, therefore, of proving that, when machinery frees the workman from his means of subsistence, it simultaneously converts those means into capital for his further employment, our apologists, with their cut-and-dried law of supply and demand, prove, on the contrary, that machinery throws workmen on the streets, not only in that branch of production in which it is introduced, but also in those branches in which it is not introduced. The real facts which are travestied by the optimism of economists are as follows. The laborers, when driven out of the workshop by the machinery, are thrown upon the labor market, and there add to the number of workmen at the disposal of the capitalists. In part VII of this book it will be seen that this effect of machinery, which, as we have seen, is represented to be a compensation to the working class, is on the contrary a most frightful scourge. For the present I will only say this: the laborers that are thrown out of work in any branch of industry can no doubt seek for employment in some other branch. If they find it, and thus renew the bond between them and the means of subsistence, this takes place only by the intermediary of a new and additional capital that is seeking investment, not at all by the intermediary of the capital that formerly employed them and was afterwards converted into machinery. And even should they find employment, what a poor lookout is theirs! Crippled as they are by division of labor, these poor devils are worth so little outside their old trade, that they cannot find admission into any industries, except a few of inferior kind, that are oversupplied with underpaid workmen. Further, every branch of industry attracts each year a new stream of men, who furnish a contingent from which to fill up vacancies, and to draw a supply for expansion. So soon as machinery sets free a part of the workmen employed in a given branch of industry, the reserve men are also diverted into new channels of employment, and become absorbed in other branches. Meanwhile, the original victims, during the period of transition, for the most part starve and perish. It is an undoubted fact that machinery, as such, is not responsible for setting free the workmen from the means of subsistence. It cheapens and increases production in that branch which it seizes on, and at first makes no change in the mass of the means of subsistence produced in other branches. Hence, after its introduction, the society possesses as much, if not more, of the necessaries of life than before, for the laborers thrown out of work, and that quite apart from the enormous share of the annual produce wasted by the non-worker. And this is the point relied on by our apologists. The contradictions and antagonisms inseparable from the capitalist employment of machinery do not exist, they say, since they do not arise out of machinery as such, but out of its capitalist employment. It's therefore machinery, considered alone, shortens the hours of labor, but when in the service of capital lengthens them, since in itself it lightens labor, but when employed by capital, heightens the intensity of labor, since in itself it is a victory of man over the forces of nature, but in the hands of capital makes man the slave of those forces, since in itself it increases the wealth of the producers, but in the hands of capital makes them paupers for all these reasons and others beside. Says the bourgeois economist without more ado, it is clear as noonday that all these contradictions are a mere semblance of the reality, and that, as a matter of fact, they have neither an actual nor a theoretical existence. Thus he saves himself from all further puzzling of the brain, and what is more, implicitly declares his opponent to be stupid enough to contend against, not the capitalistic employment of machinery, but machinery itself. No doubt he is far from denying that temporary inconvenience may result from the capitalist use of machinery. But where is the medal without its reverse? Any employment of machinery, except by capital, is to him an impossibility. Exploitation of the workman by the machine is therefore, with him, identical with exploitation of the machine by the workman. Whoever, therefore, exposes the real state of things in the capitalistic employment of machinery is against its employment in any way, and is an enemy of social progress. Exactly the reasoning of the celebrated Bill Sight. Gentlemen of the jury, no doubt the throat of this commercial traveler has been cut. But that is not my fault, it is the fault of the knife. Must we, for such a temporary inconvenience, abolish the use of the knife? Only consider, where would agriculture and trade be without the knife? Is it not as salutary in surgery as it is knowing in anatomy? And in addition, a willing help at the festive board. If you abolish the knife, you hurl us back into the depths of barbarism. Although machinery necessarily throws men out of work in those industries into which it is introduced, yet it may, notwithstanding this, bring about an increase of employment in other industries. This effect, however, has nothing in common with the so-called theory of compensation. Since every article produced by a machine is cheaper than a similar article produced by hand, we deduce the following infallible law: if the total quantity of the article produced by machinery be equal to the total quantity of the article previously produced by a handicraft or by manufacture, and now made by machinery, then the total labor expended is diminished. The new labor spent on the instruments of labor, on the machinery, on the coal, and so on, must necessarily be less than the labor displaced by the use of the machinery. Otherwise, the product of the machine would be as dear or dearer than the product of the manual labor. But as a matter of fact, the total quantity of the article produced by machinery with a diminished number of workmen, instead of remaining equal to, by far exceeds the total quantity of the handmade article that has been displaced. Suppose that yards of cloth have been produced on power looms by fewer weavers than could weave yards by hand. In the quadrupled product, there lies 4 times as much raw material. Hence, the production of raw material must be quadrupled. But as regards the instruments of labor, such as buildings, coal, machinery, and so on, it is different. The limit up to which the additional labor required for their production can increase varies with the difference between the quantity of the machine-made article and the quantity of the same article that the same number of workmen could make by hand. Hence, as the use of machinery extends in a given industry, the immediate effect is to increase production in the other industries that furnish the first with means of production. How far employment is thereby found for an increased number of men depends, given the length of the working day and the intensity of labor, on the composition of the capital employed, on the ratio of its constant to its variable component. This ratio, in its turn, varies considerably with the extent to which machinery has already seized on, or is then seizing on, those trades. The number of the men condemned to work in coal and metal mines increased enormously owing to the progress of the English factory system, but during the last few decades, this increase of number has been less rapid, owing to the use of new machinery in mining. A new type of workman springs into life along with the machine, namely its maker. We have already learnt that machinery has possessed itself, even of this branch of production on a scale that grows greater every day. As to raw material, there is not the least doubt that the rapid strides of cotton spinning not only pushed on with tropical luxuriance the growth of cotton in the United States, and with it the African slave trade, but also made the breeding of slaves the chief business of the border slave state. When the first census of slaves was taken in the United States, their number was, and it had nearly reached 4 million. On the other hand, it is no less certain that the rise of the English woolen factories, together with the gradual conversion of arable land into sheep pasture, brought about the superfluity of agricultural laborers that led to their being driven in masses into the town. Ireland, having during the last 20 years reduced its population by nearly one-half, is at this moment undergoing the process of still further reducing the number of its inhabitants, so as exactly to suit the requirements of its landlords and of the English woolen manufacturer. When machinery is applied to any of the preliminary or intermediate stages through which the subject of labor has to pass on its way to completion, there is an increased yield of material in those stages, and simultaneously an increased demand for labor in the handicrafts or manufactures supplied by the produce of the machine. Spinning by machinery, for example, supplied yarn so cheaply and so abundantly that the handloom weavers were, at first, able to work full-time without increased outlay. Their earnings accordingly rose. Hence a flow of people into the cotton-weaving trade, till at length the weavers called into existence by the jenny, the throstle, and the mule were overwhelmed by the power loom. Also, owing to the abundance of clothing materials produced by machinery, the number of tailors, seamstresses, and needlewomen went on increasing until the appearance of the sewing machine. In proportion as machinery, with the aid of a relatively small number of workpeople, increases the mass of raw materials, intermediate products, instruments of labor, and the working up of these raw materials and intermediate products becomes split up into numberless branches, social production increases in diversity. The factory system carries the social division of labor immeasurably further than does manufacture, for it increases the productiveness of the industries it seizes upon in a far higher degree. The immediate result of machinery is to augment surplus value and the mass of products in which surplus value is embodied. And as the substances consumed by the capitalists and their dependents become more plentiful, so too do these orders of society. Their growing wealth and the relatively diminished number of workmen required to produce the necessaries of life beget, simultaneously with the rise of new and luxurious wants, the means of satisfying those wants. A larger portion of the produce of society is changed into surplus produce, and a larger part of the surplus produce is supplied for consumption in a multiplicity of refined shapes. In other words, the production of luxuries increases. The refined and varied forms of the products are also due to new relations with the markets of the world, relations that are created by modern industry. Not only are greater quantities of foreign articles of luxury exchanged for home products, but a greater mass of foreign raw materials, ingredients, and intermediate products are used as means of production in the home industry. Owing to these relations with the markets of the world, the demand for labor increases in the carrying trades, which split up into numerous varieties. The increase of the means of production and subsistence, accompanied by a relative diminution in the number of laborers, causes an increased demand for labor in making canals, docks, tunnels, bridges, and so on, works that can only bear fruit in the far future. Entirely new branches of production, creating new fields of labor, are also formed, as the direct result either of machinery or of the general industrial changes brought about by it. But the place occupied by these branches in the general production is, even in the most developed countries, far from important. The number of laborers that find employment in them is directly proportional to the demand created by those industries for the crudest form of manual labor. The chief industries of this kind are, at present, gasworks, telegraphs, photography, steam navigation, and railway. According to the census for England and Wales, we find in the gas industry gasworks, production of mechanical apparatus, servants of the gas companies, and persons in telegraphy, in photography, steam navigation, and in railways, of whom the unskilled navvies, more or less permanently employed, and the whole administrative and commercial staff make up about. The total number of persons, therefore, employed in these 5 new industries amounts to. Lastly, the extraordinary productiveness of modern industry, accompanied as it is by both a more extensive and a more intense exploitation of labor power in all other spheres of production, allows of the unproductive employment of a larger and larger part of the working class, and the consequent reproduction, on a constantly extending scale, of the ancient domestic slaves under the name of a servant class, including men servants, women servants, lackeys, and according to the census of the population of England and Wales was, of these, males and female. If we deduct from this population all who are too old or too young for work, all unproductive women, young persons, and children, the ideological classes, such as government officials, priests, lawyers, soldiers, and further, all who have no occupation but to consume the labor of others in the form of rent, interest, and then lastly paupers, vagabonds, and criminals, there remain in round numbers 8 millions of the 2 sexes of every age, including in that number every capitalist who is in any way engaged in industry, commerce, or finance. Among these millions are persons agricultural laborers, all who are employed in cotton, woolen, worsted, flax, hemp, silk, and jute factories, in stocking making and lace making by machinery, all who are employed in coal mines and metal mines, all who are employed in metal works, and metal manufacturers of every kind, the servant class, all the persons employed in textile factories and in mines, taken together, number, those employed in textile factories and metal industries, taken together. Number, in both cases, less than the number of modern domestic slaves. What a splendid result of the capitalist exploitation of machinery!